Welcome back. We're closing this out with the weirdly uncomfortable truth about money and success. Today's episode is really about wealth meaning independence, not fancy spending, and why success can quietly become a trap. Also, why being rich and being wealthy are absolutely not the same thing. That distinction is such a knife twist, because everybody flexes rich and almost nobody talks about wealthy. Rich is what you buy, wealthy is what you do not have to buy. That line is annoying because it's too good and too true. And the whole thing starts with independence, not consumption. That's the piece people miss when they chase income like it is the finish line. They act like a bigger paycheck automatically means a bigger life. Sometimes it just means a bigger leash. A billionaire with a leash is still a dog, basically. That is a horrible sentence, but yes, exactly. The pressure becomes the product for a lot of successful people. And that is such a brutal insight because from the outside it looks like victory. Inside it can just be torture with better lighting. Better lighting is a hilarious way to describe a private nightmare. The idea that some people need bigger and bigger problems to stay alive is fascinating. Like they are not addicted to money, they are addicted to the next impossible thing. Exactly. And that is why rocket companies and social media purchases happen. You become so rich that you start buying pain for fun. Luxury pain, imported pain, premium pain. That is actually insane when you say it like that. But it tracks, because the brain wants challenge, not comfort forever. The challenge appetite grows and then normal life feels fake. Right, and if you do not realize that shift, you can make terrible second-act decisions. The book is basically saying your old hunger is not guaranteed to survive success, which is such an adult lesson because people think ambition is one permanent setting. But it is more like a battery that changes chemistry over time. That is extremely nerdy, but unfortunately correct. And the warning is simple. Do not confuse your old motivators with your current ones. Because the thing that made you insane in your 20s may be gone in your 40s. And some people refuse to accept that, so they keep sprinting into walls. That is where overconfidence gets dangerous too. People get right about one thing and then start acting like they are right about everything. Especially after success, because success hides how much luck was involved. Nothing says wisdom like surviving a lucky streak and calling it skill. That's such a savage takedown of half the internet. And then humility becomes the real asset, not confidence. Which is why the Roman whisperer story lands so hard. Imagine winning a war and somebody has to stand next to you saying, "Relax, champ." That is the oldest version of a good friend. Buffett having Munger is basically that same idea in modern form. You need somebody who will tell you when you are being an idiot. Most people hire assistants, not honesty. That should be embroidered on a pillow and sold to founders. The same humility shows up in the house conversation too. I love that he refuses to treat housing like a stock pick. Because for most people, a house is a life decision first and a math decision second. People love pretending spreadsheets can decide where their children sleep. That is a psychotic sentence, but yes, people really do that. Stability, neighborhood, noise, school, all of that matters more than a return chart. Renting can actually be the smarter move when mobility matters. And then when family life changes, buying can become the better emotional choice. Which means the correct answer is annoyingly personal. The market hates when your answer is about your own life. That whole section is really about rejecting fake financial objectivity. Not every decision has to be optimized into a tax spreadsheet. Thank God, because that would make everything miserable. The other huge idea here is compounding, especially the stuff working against you. People know compounding can grow wealth, but they ignore how it grows damage, too. A cigarette a day sounds harmless until the math gets terrifying. The same with sleep, stress, bad habits, and even bad assumptions. And that is why the slow stuff matters more than the dramatic stuff. Because good news compounds quietly, and bad news shows up like a fire alarm. The headline economy is basically built by panic and caffeine. That is too accurate to be funny. His point is that we are terrible at exponential thinking. We can handle +8 +8, but not 8 times 8 times 8. My brain just filed a complaint listening to that. Which is why people underestimate both investing and self-destruction. And they also underestimate how much pain can become useful. The hard chapter idea is basically that discomfort is not a bug, it is often the engine. War is an extreme example, but even personal setbacks can create growth. Layoffs, breakups, illness, all of it can become the thing that changes you. Not while it is happening, obviously. In the moment, it just feels like loss. But later, it can look like the thing that forced clarity. That Stephen Core example was wild because gratitude there feels almost impossible. Yet that is exactly the point. Hindsight can reveal meaning you could not see then. Which brings us to the ending, where he basically refuses to hand out commandments. He wants people thinking, not obeying. A shocking move for an author, honestly. Really rebellious behavior from a guy with books. But it fits the whole philosophy, because money advice is never universal. The right move for one person is completely wrong for another. And that is why everyone online sounds confident and still gets it wrong. Confidence is cheap, context is expensive. That should probably be the slogan of the whole series. Honestly, it all comes back to the same lesson: protect your independence. Whether it is money, work, relationships, or time, freedom is the real dividend. And if you can keep enough humility to notice your blind spots, you stay dangerous in a good way. Dangerous in a good way is the dream sentence for any sane person. That is probably the cleanest way to close this whole arc. Wealth is not the thing you spend, it is the thing that gives you room to breathe. And with that, we are done with this 3-part run. Honestly, this one felt like a masterclass and a warning label at the same time. I think that is exactly right. Thanks for riding through the whole series with us, and we will see you on the next one. Welcome back. We are closing the loop on wealth, pressure, and staying hungry. This one gets into why success can quietly become its own problem, and why a bigger bank account does not always mean a better life. The wild part is how often people confuse motion with meaning. That line about hunger changing over time is so uncomfortable, because apparently nobody wants to admit they are not starving anymore. Right, everyone wants to keep playing like they are broke and desperate. But that is exactly where bad decisions start sneaking in. The best version of that idea is brutal, though. He is basically saying, sit down and do nothing for a year. That is such an offensive piece of advice to ambitious people. It is offensive because it is probably right for a lot of them. The ego hates that because it wants to prove the old engine still works. And sometimes the old engine is just burning fuel for no reason. Exactly, and then the real win is finding a moonshot that actually scares you again. Not a fake moonshot. A real one that makes your hands shake a little. That is why the billionaire examples hit so hard. It is not about money at that level. It is about competition and torture. Which is a horrifying career strategy if you are not built like that. Most of us would retire the second the number looked silly. And yet some people keep climbing because the challenge is the drug. That part matters because people think wealth ends the game. It does not end the game, it just changes the board. And sometimes the board gets way more stressful. Tom from MySpace looked like he won the cleaner version of the game. Meanwhile, Zuckerberg's is carrying a stadium of expectations on his back. One guy is hiking in Bali, the other is being yelled at by civilization. That is an insane side-by-side. But there is something real there about pressure as a motivator. Too little pressure and people drift, too much and they crack. So the sweet spot is enough stress to stay alive, not enough to implode. Basically, the human operating system is a mess. That is the most accurate thing anyone has said all episode. The humility piece sits right next to that, though, because success tricks you into thinking your luck was skill. And once you believe that, you start making expert mistakes in new arenas. The doctor investing problem is such a perfect example of that. Great at medicine suddenly thinks he can read the market, as if a stethoscope comes with a stock picker upgrade. The killer is that nobody wants to tell you you are getting too confident, especially when you are already winning and everyone around you benefits from agreeing. That is why the Roman whisperer story is so good. Imagine winning a war and still needing a guy to remind you to chill out. That is actually a beautiful system because power needs friction. Buffett having Munger as a truth teller is the modern version of that. Everyone says they want honesty until honesty is about them. Then suddenly the honest friend becomes a hater. The whole wealth conversation gets sharper when you separate rich from wealthy. Rich is spending power, wealth is unspent freedom. That distinction feels simple until your life gets noisy. Then it becomes the whole game, because freedom buys choices. Like choosing when to work, where to live, or when to step back. Or choosing not to buy the dumb thing just because the internet is watching. The house example is where this gets really practical. Because for some people, it is a lifestyle decision, and for others, it is a trap. If you need mobility, buying a house can be financial cosplay. Financial cosplay is vicious and extremely accurate. But if you have kids and want stability, the math changes completely. That is why advice without context is basically decorative. Look smart breaks immediately in real life. And that ties into why the best story wins so often. Facts matter, but people move when a story clicks emotionally. Which is annoying because it means the best spreadsheet does not always win. A good story compresses complexity into something people can feel. That is why the vaccine example is so chilling. The wrong story can spread faster than the truth. And once it emotionally lands, facts have to fight uphill forever. That is not just media, that is human psychology. We are just story machines with receipts. That should not be as funny as it is. The compounding section might be the most dangerous idea in the whole arc. Because good things feel too slow and bad things feel too invisible. Then one day, your health or your money or your career has quietly changed. The bill arrives with interest, which is rude but fair. The rice board example is still undefeated, honestly. It is such a ridiculous image that it somehow sticks forever. That is the point, because our brains are terrible with exponential growth. We can feel 8 plus 8 plus 8, but not multiplication over time. Which is why people underestimate both ruin and fortune. Then the discomfort chapter lands like a punch. Stress and pain are not just side effects, they are often the payment. The world literally gets better because hard things happen. That is the most unintuitive thing in the series and maybe the truest. On a personal level, it is the same story with layoffs and breakups. In the moment it feels like collapse, later it can look like rescue. That does not make the pain pretty, it just makes the meaning bigger. And that is why the closing question about regret mattered so much. It was not regret in a dramatic sense, it was worry wasted on ghosts. That is probably the most relatable regret anybody can have. Not the disasters that happened, the disasters you rehearsed, which is such a brutal way to describe anxiety. But it also explains why wealth matters beyond consumption. Wealth is the ability to breathe without panicking about tomorrow. It is time, options, flexibility, and less fear. It is not the yacht, it is the ability to say no to the yacht. That is such a great line and also annoyingly true. I think that is the thread running through all 3 episodes. Not how do I look richer, but how do I become freer? And that is a much harder, much better question. It also makes the series feel less like advice and more like a mirror, which is probably why it lands so hard, and why people end up rethinking their entire life in the shower. That is us wrapping the series, and I hope it gave you something useful. More than anything, I hope it gave you better questions. We will see you on the next one, and hopefully nobody bought a house for the wrong reasons. Welcome back. We are finishing on wealth, pressure, and the weird price of staying hungry. And honestly, this episode gets into why money is often about freedom, not flexing. What hit you first, the independence thing or the pressure thing? The pressure thing, because billionaires sounding miserable is such a wild sentence. The most expensive life can still be the most emotionally grim. Right, and the Tom from MySpace example is so savage for that reason. One guy is hiking in Bali, and another is getting screamed at by Congress. And somehow the one with less money sounds calmer. That is the whole point, though, because wealth buys control over your time. Not the ability to buy louder stuff, the ability to stop being pushed around. Yes, and that flips the whole scoreboard in your head. People think wealth is a bigger car, but it is really a bigger pause button. That pause button is what lets you say no to bad work. Or no to a life that looks successful but feels like a trap. The scary part is people chase rich-looking things while losing the freedom they wanted. And they do it with a loan attached, which is hilarious and terrifying. Borrowing hundreds of thousands to maybe make money is such a chaotic hobby. Real estate as a personality disorder, basically. But the house discussion was great because it was not anti-house. It was anti-mistaking a lifestyle decision for an investment thesis. That distinction is everything, especially with kids in the picture. Stability starts sounding sexy very fast once your life gets loud. Suddenly, granite countertops are not the point. A quiet neighborhood is. And that is why the spreadsheet can lie to you. Because the spreadsheet asks what makes money, not what makes your actual life work. Spreadsheets never have to raise children next door to strangers. Brutal, but true. The other thing I kept thinking about was how success changes your hunger. That is such an uncomfortable idea because people assume success should compound motivation. But it can actually shrink the engine. Exactly. And then people try to start another business with old fuel. Which is why the hardest advice he got was basically do nothing for a year. That is the least entrepreneurial sentence ever spoken. Imagine telling a founder to sit on their hands and become interesting again. But that is kind of genius because hunger is a resource. And once you are no longer starving, you cannot pretend you are. That is why the moonshot matters, right? Yeah, you need a new problem big enough to scare your nervous system back to life. Elon buying Twitter is exactly that kind of insane move. It is a billionaire version of picking a fight with a mountain. Most of us would have retired to a nice chair and become normal. But the book argues that some people are just built to keep escalating. And that is not always healthy, even if it is impressive. It can look like ambition from the outside and torture from the inside, which is such a strange price to pay for being excellent. I also love the point that challenge appetite grows, like games getting harder. That makes sense, because if life gets too easy, the brain starts wandering. Then you invent problems, which is the premium subscription of modern anxiety. That is so accurate it hurts. But there is a thin line between needing challenge and needing chaos. And successful people cross that line all the time because they think they are still underdog mode. That overconfidence chapter is dangerous, honestly. Being right in one arena makes people think they are right in every arena. Investors think they can be politicians. Doctors think they can be stock pickers. And then everybody discovers humility the expensive way. Usually with public money, which is the worst classroom. That is why the Roman whisperer story lands so hard. Even in victory, somebody had to remind you that you are still fallible. That is not insulting, it is grounding. And Charlie Munger was basically that for Buffett. Which is funny because the richest people still need an anti-delusion friend. Billionaires are just people with very expensive blind spots. The compounding section also felt like a direct attack on how our brains work. Because humans are terrible at exponential thinking. 8 plus 8 plus 8 feels easy. Then 8 times 8 becomes a crisis. Our brains are basically linear little potatoes. And that is why we underestimate both smoking and investing so badly. The scary part is that good things compound slowly, and bad things can compound invisibly. One bad habit looks harmless until it owns your life. One good habit looks boring until it changes your future. That is such a clean way to think about everything from sleep to saving. And the rice board story is cheesy but devastatingly effective. It is the kind of thing people dismiss until they actually do the math. Which is why the book keeps coming back to time horizons. Because your horizon changes the answer to almost every money question. Renting, buying, saving, working, retiring, all of it depends on what season you are in. The same choice can be brilliant for one person and terrible for another. Which is annoying for people who want universal rules. Sorry, life refused to become a spreadsheet. That is why the book never gives you a neat prescription. It keeps asking you what you actually want, which is the harder job. And maybe the more honest job. The story wins idea is another one that sounds obvious until you see it everywhere. Facts matter, but stories move people. Which explains why a vivid nonsense story can beat a dry truth. That vaccine example was exactly the nightmare version of that. The danger is not just persuasion, it is persuasion without truth. And once people hear what they want, correction becomes almost irrelevant. That part is bleak because it means attention is the real battlefield. The other huge idea was that stress and discomfort are often the entry fee for progress, which is such a better framing than pretending hard things are optional. The phrase overhead cost of getting ahead is annoyingly perfect. Bureaucracy, nonsense, long hours, emotional damage, welcome to growth. And on a bigger level, history itself seems to improve through disaster. Which is dark, but also weirdly true if you look at innovation. A lot of breakthroughs are born inside terrible situations. Personally, I think that is why layoffs and breakups can become gifts later. Not in the moment, obviously, because the moment is usually awful. The moment is a disaster and the future is the therapist. But hindsight often reveals that the pain rerouted you somewhere better. That is a hard thing to believe until life proves it to you. And then the final layer is regret, which was painfully human. He basically said he wasted too much time worrying. That is so relatable it almost hurts to hear out loud. Because most of our fear is just unpaid mental rent. Unpaid mental rent is crazy, I'm stealing that. But it closes the whole series beautifully, because the real lesson is not optimize harder. It is understand yourself better before you chase more. More money, more status, more growth, none of that matters if you do not know the cost. And that is the perfect place to end the series honestly. Wealth is freedom, success has a price, and hunger evolves whether you like it or not. Which means the smartest move is usually not panic, not flexing, just thinking longer. We will leave it there. And if this series made you rethink anything, that is the win. Thanks for riding through all 3 episodes with us, and we will see you next time. Welcome back. We are ending with the weirdest truth. Money buys independence, not happiness. And the second weird truth is that success can make you less hungry, not more. Which sounds insulting, but it is also just brutally human. That whole rich versus wealthy distinction is the spine of this episode. Because rich is visible, but wealthy is hidden in what you do not spend. Basically, the best flex is having the freedom to ignore flexing. That is such a painful sentence for the internet to hear. And yet it explains why low stress often beats high income. Hold on, because people hate that idea when they first hear it. They want the yacht answer, not the boring freedom answer. Right, they want the shiny thing, not the thing that lets them sleep. But that is exactly the point. Wealth is unspent optionality. The money sitting there is what creates choices later. That is why the frugal parent story always lands so hard. They were not chasing applause, they were building margin. And margin is what lets you survive when life gets rude. Life is always rude eventually, by the way. The episode really keeps circling one thing. Pressure changes people. At first, pressure looks like the enemy, then it becomes the fuel. That is the part I love because it is so counterintuitive. A lot of people need challenge to stay alive inside their own work. And if the challenge disappears, they start inventing nonsense. Fake problems, fake urgency, fake crises, the whole tragic package. They will stress about a headline font if the real battle is gone. Honestly, yes, rich people do love a new imaginary emergency. But the better version is what Housel talks about. Find a new mountain. Not because you are empty, but because your old hunger expired. That is such a brutal phrase, but it feels true. The danger is pretending the old motivation still works. That is where people get themselves into ridiculous trouble. You are not the same person who built the first thing. And if you ignore that, your next project can become ego theater. Which is probably why some billionaires keep swinging harder and harder. They are not necessarily chasing money anymore. They are chasing the feeling of being tested. Meanwhile, the rest of us are trying to avoid emails. Different species, honestly. But even that giant appetite has a cost. The more you win, the more your confidence can outrun your judgment. That is such a nasty trap because success feels like evidence. It feels like proof that you are right about everything. Which is how a doctor suddenly becomes a stock picker. Or an investor becomes an expert on literally every subject on earth. The humility point keeps showing up because it is the guardrail. Without humility, you stop checking your blind spots. And then the success that protected you starts to corrupt you. That Roman warrior whispering thing was such a great image. Imagine winning a war and still needing someone to humble you in the parade. But that is probably the healthiest system ever invented. Because almost nobody self-corrects once applause gets loud. They start believing the room owes them clarity. Then there is the house conversation, which I think everyone secretly needed. Because people treat housing like a moral test instead of a life decision. Spreadsheet people always act like every decision is an investment thesis, as if a kitchen is a bond yield. That is exactly the kind of sentence finance people deserve. But the real answer is simple. If you need mobility, rent. If you need stability for kids and family, buy for your life. Not because it is the best spreadsheet move, but because it fits your season. That is a huge theme in this whole episode, actually. Different seasons need different financial choices. The mistake is pretending one rule fits every chapter. Then the story swerves into storytelling, and that might be the strongest point. Because yes, the best story wins even when the facts are weaker. That is terrifying and also obviously true. Humanity is basically a story-eating machine. Facts matter, but stories decide whether facts get remembered. That is why vivid nonsense can beat dry truth so easily. The lie with better packaging gets more clicks. That is unfortunately a very clean summary of civilization. And on the compounding side, that is where the episode gets genuinely useful. Because good things usually compound slowly, and bad things explode fast. That is such an unfair asymmetry. It is why people miss progress and overreact to crisis. The world gets healthier, safer, and richer in tiny increments. Nobody headlines gradual improvement like it is a natural disaster. Heart disease mortality is improving? Break the internet. But bad compounding works the same way in reverse. One bad habit is nothing until it becomes a lifestyle. One cigarette is tiny. 30 years is a verdict. One bad night of sleep is manageable. Years of it are destructive. That is why the compounding lesson is so sticky. It applies everywhere, not just money. Then the discomfort section comes in and ties the whole thing together. Because a lot of growth only shows up after pressure arrives. That is the part people hate in real time and love in hindsight. Classic human behavior, suffer now, call it wisdom later. The upside of down is not a cute phrase, it is a real pattern. Loss, breakup, layoffs, illness, they can all reroute a life. And the reroute can be the upgrade. Not always, obviously, but often enough to matter. That is why the episode never becomes just optimism. It is more like respect for reality, which is much less marketable but way more useful. And that brings us to the final takeaway. Know your cost. Every good thing charges rent somewhere else. Money charges stress. Careers charge time. Relationships charge compromise. That is basically life in one sentence, annoyingly enough. The goal is not to avoid the cost, it is to choose it consciously. That is what makes wealth feel like independence instead of consumption. You buy room to breathe, not just room to spend. And that is why this final episode feels like the cleanest conclusion. Not optimize harder, just understand yourself better. That is annoyingly hard advice because it does not sound sexy. But it is the kind that survives real life. So if this series made you rethink wealth, hunger, or pressure, we won. Thanks for riding through all 3 episodes with us, and we will see you next time.